So in this video, what we're going to go through is something that I'm going to affectionately be calling the Hall of Shame. That might have like a negative connotation, but I certainly don't intend it to have. It's kind of a little bit more catchy, I guess. But, a while ago when teaching more on campus and university and kind of trying to keep a student's level of interest in an end goal, there's quite the slog to learning anatomy and construction and perspective, and it could feel kind of labor intensive. So it's always good to kind of keep that end goal in mind of what you might want to be doing. So let's say what we're looking at in something like this would be, like the appreciation of style, to appreciate it fully, right? As something that we would maybe want to take from, learn, do ourselves, and otherwise just try to engage with how other people are working in the most generous of terms. So what is style, right? And this is every class I get asked this. Teach gesture. How do I finish it? Teach anatomy. How do I render it? But people always want to be leaning towards the end goal. I've started with one of my favorite artists. I grew up reading the Image comic group as they were working at Marvel and other places. So I grew up on Rob Liefeld. I grew up on Todd McFarlane. I grew up on Mark Silvestri. Go down the list, right? And I think that's an important historical moment in comics. Right? There's a ton there to celebrate for what, not just the content they created, but what they did in terms of developing a space for artists to work outside of the two big comic companies. But I also see it as a moment of stylistic change, right? So I think of early comics as exhibiting tendencies that are more toward the classical, right? Order, proportion, a certain conservatism of the overall proportions of the body and how it's treated. The early comic bodies felt statuesque and kind of posed in a way that kept a universal harmony to the body, the proportion of the frame and composition. Whereas these artists to me felt more baroque, which is, more characteristic of excess, detail, a labyrinthine type of visual engagement. It's not that anything is bad or good, right? That's what I dislike about the conversations around these artists. Like, I think Rob Liefeld maybe gets it the worst, right? It's blogs devoted to, how bad his covers are. Okay, right? So we get it, right? Maybe they don't look proportioned. So that stuff to me just seems like I belong to the club, right? Like I get that it's wrong, or I get that it doesn't look right. Okay, boring, right? So, but what's really going on? How can we think about it? How can we analyze it, break it down for things that are happening, and then use those as opportunities to think about decision making, right? What if this is something that you want to do, right? This is a way that you could treat any of your favorite artists, is to go in and look critically about the choices that they're making. We get it, right? Little feet, proportion might be off. Let's move on. Let's see what we can figure out that might be a little bit more interesting than just maybe signaling to the rest of the community that you also know that the feet are small, or it doesn't add much. We get it. Maybe your top 10 covers are a little different than the other. I think this is a more engaging way to look at it. What if this is a Baroque period in comics in which excess, visual ornamentation, and the purposeful distortion of the figure takes precedence as opposed to the correct quote unquote anatomy? And this is coming from a guy that just teaches correct anatomy to people. Let's take a look at this, right? And this would be, this is something that you could tell me if you like, or if this is something that you think is useful, or if this is something that you think that you might want to share some imagery to that might help me kind of think about stuff that you would like to see broken down. But this would be my beginning, right? I would identify a historical component. How do I frame this, right? And you could see this, like it doesn't just have to be that this is the 1600s and, it's not like that. These are ways or filters that you can look at broader movements or more specific movements. Like when I was a kid, they used to have a t-shirt at a store called Urban Outfitters that, because I don't go outside my home or shop at all anymore, I don't even know if it still exists. It used to have the old Nintendo on the front with the little door that popped up and you put the cartridge in here, and it would say classically trained, right? So classically trained, what does that mean? Well, maybe early video games exhibit a quality of classicism, right? Early video games are defined by a frame. The characters very rarely leave that frame, and all the action takes place within here. And the conception of the frame, right, in classic painting or classic video games is that the frame is a border through which the happenings inside are separated from the world outside, which means that we suspend disbelief and participate in the illusion taking place within the frame. It's a cordoned off kind of section of reality. The Baroque is different. Think of Baroque video games or video games of today. The frame is permeable. The goal in video games is really to blur the line of illusion. The video game is a continuous, you're VR, you're in the game, or the controller shakes and has a kinetic or a haptic function that immerses you in the game. So you could look at it that way, right? You don't have to just look at comics, but there could be a different quality of immersion that the Baroque may involve that the classical may not, right? That's usually focused around the spectacular, the detail, the ornate. Sometimes you could think that the Baroque is all of the rules of the classical, but hyper accelerated. So, right, that's just another way to think about how I'm setting up the historical frame and then ways that you could shift it or move it. So if we look at the basic breakdown in terms of, let's start with this one. So how would we appreciate this, right? So ways to appreciate it would be, it's cool. I think a lot of what's going on here is really dynamic from the standpoint of comics. The first thing that you can notice is that the body is heavily distorted. We're not going to be able to do our 7.5 to 8 heads tall. We're not going to be able to do our thirds between heads 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 to set up where the rib cage is going. All that's gone, right? That's a good foundation. It's really important to know that. But this artist is making different decisions. And so in the most generous of spirits, I want to learn what those decisions are about. Rib cage is here. So let's say I could see the thoracic arch or like a representation of it here. And so this would be the rib cage. I'm gonna leave the giant breasts off, right? So of course that's what we see, that the breasts are probably half as big as the rib cage. That's a stylistic choice, of course, but we're gonna suspend criticism. But the part of this is just the visual language that comics traffics in too, right? Every woman in comics is more than likely in this pose this time. There's lots of sites that kind of break down the differences or the inappropriate positions. Like I'm thinking specifically of the blog, Less Tits and Ass, More Kickin' Ass. That's a great blog for kind of breaking down the inappropriate depiction of women in comics, right? And how to make those poses that are hyper exaggerated feel more natural. So this is trafficking in that convention. There's a convention of how, people, men, women are depicted. And so in this, we have maybe the impossible position, would be impossible anatomically, to turn the rib cage, not impossible, but getting there, 3/4 front, and then to also see the pelvis 3/4 back. So that's quite a spin, or that's quite a twist, let's say. So in this, if we break that down from the standpoint of what the body is doing, how do we use maybe some of those tools of construction to think about the body and its position? The rib cage is going this way, so waist, and then that turns, so that's twisting, and then we get the pelvis at the side, and then we also see the pelvis at the back. So uncomfortable. Hard to do. Let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt, right? Let's say everybody did what they did on purpose instead of just trying to bash everybody for making mistakes. It's just I think it's a more interesting way to participate in the arts broadly, right? Why is that being made? Why do they make that decision? Well, it's a convention in comics one, right? So in comics, we see this all the time. So to come in and do like a classical proportioned figure, right, during the 90s or during Liefeld's run on this book particularly, wouldn't make sense. It doesn't fit with, let's say, the overall convention of the time. Just like if you were a Rubens, it would be bizarre to be alive in the classical and try to make your large and ornate kind of knotted compositions of people interacting. So there's that, right? There's that one. The other thing is, this isn't unrelated to an entire kind of canon of the way that people are depicted as beautiful. If we just took the frame of American illustration, but you could largely apply this to a lot of ages. Take, for example, Charles Dana Gibson, who's one of the earliest American illustrators and the inventor of the Gibson girl. It wasn't uncommon for American illustrators to define a type, both male and female, and then be recognized widely for that type as giving rise to a new canon of beauty. But these depictions of beauty are also largely based on social convention, class, but a real common element, without going too deep into it, is hyper attenuated waists. small feet, small hands, and there could be different reasons for this. Any way that you want to slice it or look at this, right? You could bring a different perspective. But the major critic of this, or theorist of this artist at this time, is Thorsten Veblen. And he talks about how the reason that this was defined or found to be beautiful was because it signs for conspicuous waist, which means that in the highest classes in their convention of dress, what they were signaling was their degree of wealth by the way they dressed. So to have an attenuated waist, to have very small feet, was a sign of the absence of labor, right? To wear a corset, which would be required, or a bustle, a crinoline, which would be kind of made from whalebone, right? These were signs of the absence of labor. And if you didn't labor, if you weren't working, you had wealth and you had leisure time. To have a waist that's narrow as a standard or depiction of beauty, or small feet, right, or a broader waist, isn't outside the pale. Is the connotation for what women are supposed to look like due to men's depiction, right, and kind of categorization and stereotyping of women, is that appropriate? Definitely not, right? So I'm not making an argument for women needing to look like this. What I'm trying to do is offer a more generous take on something that I see to be highly criticized all the time, without much productive conversation going on. So I do see both sides of it though. So that's just one way to frame this. So the basic idea is, or what I'm proposing is, this isn't so aberrant that we would not be able to find any other type of stereotyping that would feel or resonate with what's already been done here. That's one way we could look at the whole, maybe we now appreciate a trajectory of illustration differently. And with that appreciation, we could be more critical, right? We could say that we could look for different models throughout American history for how women were depicted, right? Outside of maybe more of the mainstream, or we can make corrections. I mean, there's lots of things to focus on here to kind of nitpick how muscles transition and create flow, right? But again, I'm going in trying to make more of a purposeful celebration in terms of turning down the criticality. So what would we also say? Let's say that going back to this, let's say that's what was in mind here, is that there's a convention around comics that is a long enduring stereotype that exists in popular entertainment and culture dating back to the early 1900s, something like that. So what has been done to our rigid 8-head figure? So if we kind of think about that rigid overall, proportioned 8-head figure with the halfway at the pelvis, legs half, upper torso half, so on and so forth. Well, I think one way to have fun with this is, instead of insisting that this always needs to be correct all the time, to think about instead what's been done and what did it give me. So it's no longer half-half, right? And so maybe we look at that over here. It's no longer, right, if my general proportional chart would be 8 heads and then some kind of balance between structure or bone and anatomy, hard versus soft, this seems to remove all of the hard surface. So now let's say in this conception of a figure, we're at a deficit for hard surface, and in its place, I'm only seeing curve, right? It doesn't feel to me like there's much skeleton here, in other words. I'd say the hardest line I see would be the jaw. And I think that's actually kind of interesting, right? This is the hardest angle, or maybe the chin. But everything else that I see when it comes to anatomy, the development of contour, rhythm on top of this, it's almost as if somebody just sucked all the hard surface out and left us just with rhythm, curve, right? So now what do we do with that? That's just the classic character archetype for the feminine design. Go back and look at the Disney lineup, right? For the different archetypes: hero, heroine, brute, sidekicks, villain, right? So we're kind of dealing with this, but in an extreme way. It's not the Disney princess. It's this logic, but pushed, accelerated. If think of these things in a more objective way, what do I know? Right? How can I use my classical information? How can I use the training that we develop? With that as a lens, look at what's there and what isn't. This has been left out, this has been celebrated, and then this has been skewed. So we've probably moved we've made this a little bit shorter, right? So let's look at it here. Pelvis to head. So let's say top of skull is here. In a proportioned figure, we'd want the foot to be here, right? Because this should be the halfway. So this should meet there. So that should be foot. So what does it mean to exaggerate the lower half of the figure? Well, maybe to increase the height, we have a more, let's say, any number of qualities. Maybe it makes it more powerful, and that puts it in the category of the superhero or heroine in this case. Maybe by extending the lower legs, or I'm sorry, the legs upper and lower, we're increasing a degree of elegance because it's accentuating the degree to which curve continues, right, and moves in that direction. Or if we looked at, the new proportion after a move down, it still keeps the big broad ones, like the knee is still halfway. I think even like some of the costume, the hair, if we start to look at these qualities, participates in that highly active rhythmic structure, right, of flow down the figure. So those would be all kind of generous things, right? Or ways to praise what I see, ways to be the most generous, not for someone else, right? I don't care about someone else's feelings or insulting another artist. I mean, I think that's important, right? But it's for me. How can I take away what's being done so that maybe I could use it for myself? I think that's the best outcome for an exercise like this, is to see this convention with meaning, or to see a historical convention that could give me context, or to understand how my proportion chart might be malleable and produce different effects that I might want by way of just celebrating one thing at the expense of something else. But you can also be critical, like what isn't working. I don't love the design around the knees because it isn't clear ultimately where the knee is. And I think what doesn't work there for me is that, and so this is something that we can maybe be sympathetic to, like learning the knee sucks. The areas of transition in the body are always the hardest. So one thing I might try to avoid is too much symmetry through here, right? That's something that maybe you heard me say in a class or another teacher. And so, yeah, that feels a little awkward, right? Maybe I can look at that and say, there's a lot about this I like, but that is a harder sell. I feel like we lose anatomical rhythm, and this is something that's all about defining elegance, curve, right? It's about really pushing the degree to which I experience that in this new register of comics, where everything is amped up. Masculinity, femininity, sex, right? Because of, one thing we left out, who is the audience? Who are we selling these to? Audience always matters. Is this a pop art audience? Is this a fine art audience? Is this a mass audience, et cetera, et cetera? Who is consuming it? That might be a little off. Proportion, we said, I gave the excuse or the pass here that it was purposeful. It's not uncommon to see small head, small hands, small feet. So I might put that in this bucket. That's a convention of beauty for some, for this genre specifically. Good or bad, I'm taking that out. I'm taking value judgments out. I think there's areas that I would want to study that are intersection areas. So I would put that in this category here. The intersection of the knee to me looks to be a little bit too rigid. And I think the shoulder or the neck, right? Intersections are hard. So in that same knee, which I put the arrows by, maybe I do some extra studies here just to figure out, my own work, because there's so much here that I like, but I'd want to make sure that keep those, like maybe that sartorius line could come more, which I think is that one, across and then around and loop me to that lower leg. But I think the challenge around women is that, or drawing women in this kind of stylized way, is that more information usually makes it feel a little less appealing. So there's a balance, a difficult balance here between the brevity of description and keeping that style, and then trying to kind of push some of the more anatomical qualities that we may want. So maybe I would go for something like this instead, and at least that keeps me with, some broader asymmetries, and then some transition, like I'm pulling out maybe the fat to soften the top of the knee, but there might be a patella in here. This is my ligament. This is the sartorius coming down and then sneaking that calf up and behind the hamstring. Or maybe I do the same thing for the shoulder. Do the same thing. How can I figure out that transition? This arm right now, if we were to break this one down a little bit more, feels a little bit too forward and kind of almost in front of the rib cage. So I bet if we just found a few overlaps here, we kind of set that back and give it more of that equal plane across the clavicle. And then maybe that feels better or not. You don't know. The other part, I guess, this feels a little out of place. So maybe we think, might look for something in terms of costume design where it's not as heavy a shape at the bottom. So I think the goal of this is that not everything needs to have the same lens applied to it. We know that the rib cage is challenged, right? If we were to put in a skeleton that, maybe the waist wouldn't support a digestive tract. Or maybe the feet are too small. Fine, got it, right? Now let's move on. What else could be a part of that conversation? These types of studies are ways that I like to try to embrace that and move beyond just the slamming and into something that might ultimately be more productive or useful for me. So hopefully you found it interesting.